They arrested a black man at a rest stop, mocked him, humiliated him, had no idea he was the judge who'd decide their fate the very next day. What happened in that courtroom will leave you speechless. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. It all started with flashing red and blue lights. The late afternoon sun was just beginning to dip behind the horizon as Michael Davis pulled into a quiet rest stop along Interstate 79. He was halfway through a long drive home after giving a keynote speech at a legal ethics seminar. The irony of that day's topic, bias in policing and the role of the law, would soon hit harder than he ever imagined. Michael, a sharply dressed black man in his mid-40s, wore a navy-tailored suit that spoke volumes of his success and presence. He had an air of calm control about him, the kind that comes from decades of walking confidently through courtrooms where the stakes are always high. He parked his black sedan, got out, stretched his legs, and made his way toward the vending machines. A steaming coffee in one hand and a tablet in the other, he sat down at a bench overlooking the parking lot. Just another man taking a break on the road. But peace is a fragile thing when you're black in America. Without warning, red and blue lights filled the sky. A police cruiser screeched into the rest stop, followed immediately by two more. The sudden arrival shattered the quiet. Doors flung open. Three white officers stepped out briskly, hands near their weapons. The lead officer, broad-shouldered and visibly agitated, immediately locked eyes with Michael. "You, put your hands where we can see them," he shouted. Startled, Michael raised his hands instinctively but remained seated. His brows furrowed, confused more than alarmed. "Excuse me? Officers, what's the issue here?" The lead officer pointed aggressively. "We got a report of a suspicious black male loitering around cars." "That you?" Michael stood slowly, calmly, keeping his hands visible. "I'm just having coffee. I'm not bothering anyone. I'm a judge, in fact. I was on my way home. I can show you my ID." He reached into his coat pocket carefully and pulled out his wallet, revealing a silver badge and judicial identification card. But before he could even hold it out fully, the officer slapped it to the ground. "Yeah, sure you are. Heard that one before," he snapped. "Turn around. Hands behind your back." "Wait, this is a mistake," Michael tried to explain. But the cuffs clicked tightly around his wrists before he could finish. The second officer began frisking him roughly, pushing him against the squad car while the third kept his hand on his taser. A small group of travelers nearby had begun to gather, some pulling out their phones, recording silently from a distance. A mother shielded her child's eyes as Michael was shoved into the back seat of a cruiser. Michael sat there, stunned. Not because of fear, not even because of the insult, but because this wasn't the first time he'd seen racism up close. It was just the first time in a long while that it had worn a uniform and acted this boldly, this carelessly. His mind flashed back to law school lectures, to heated debates in court about reasonable suspicion, how easily it was used as a cover, how often it turned into nothing more than an excuse to harass someone based on their skin. But now, it wasn't theory. It was him. In the holding cell, Michael was booked without delay. His personal effects were taken, fingerprints captured, mugshot snapped. The charge listed, loitering and resisting arrest. Resisting? He hadn't even raised his voice. The officers mocked him behind his back. Another one pretending to be someone he's not. One of them snorted. "Judge my ass." He wasn't given a phone call. No one bothered to verify his identity. It was as if his credentials were invisible. He was tossed into a small holding cell with a flickering light and a rusted toilet. The smell of stale sweat clung to the concrete. He sat on the edge of the metal bench, still in his suit, but now it was wrinkled and stained. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, grounding himself. He knew he had done nothing wrong, and he knew morning would bring something none of those officers could see coming. The twist of fate. At exactly 7 a.m., a guard came to his cell with a clipboard. "Davis, you've got court today. Holding you till the hearing." Michael smiled calmly. "Oh, I know." The guard, still unaware of the full situation, led him back to processing. His ID had finally been confirmed, but even now, no apology had come. No correction, just quiet embarrassment. "You'll be before the judge after the break," the officer muttered. Michael chuckled under his breath. "Not before. I am the judge," he whispered. Michael Davis had spent his entire adult life inside courtrooms, but never like this. The sound of the cold steel door slamming shut behind him echoed through the concrete hallway like a gavel crashing down on his dignity. The holding cell was dimly lit, grimy, and smelled of mildew and sweat. A single bench, a stained toilet in the corner, and flickering fluorescent lights overhead were his new reality. This wasn't the private chambers he was used to. No polished wood desk, no books of law, just cement and silence. He sat down, still wearing his wrinkled suit, now creased from the squad car ride and slightly damp from being shoved into the back seat on a humid summer night. His tie hung loose around his neck, and his hands, still red from the tightness of the cuffs, rested on his knees as he stared at the floor. From the other side of the bars, the voices of the arresting officers echoed. "You? A judge?" "Yeah, right," one of them sneered. "Bet he's just another slick-talking lawyer trying to play the system." Michael didn't respond. He didn't argue. He didn't beg. He had no reason to. The truth, like justice, didn't need to yell that he had tried to show them his judicial badge, one issued by the state itself. But they had treated it like it was fake. They hadn't even checked, just threw it aside like trash. To them, the idea of a black man sitting on a bench in a courtroom was simply unbelievable. That disbelief had landed him in a cell. He was processed like any other detainee. Fingerprints, photographs, a personal property form filled out with every item taken from him that he asked for a phone call. Later, a desk sergeant said dismissively, "It never came." Sleepless and silent that night, the cold bench offered no rest. Michael sat upright, back against the wall, arms folded. Every time his eyes closed, they snapped open again, not from fear, but from disbelief. How many men like me have sat in places like this, with no one believing them? He'd spent years on the bench defending those unfairly profiled. He had written opinions about racial bias in traffic stops. He had spoken at universities about integrity and the rule of law. Yet, here he was, reduced to a case number. A headline. In the making, every hour or so, a guard passed by. One paused to peer in. "You still claiming to be a judge?" he asked, half amused. Michael looked at him with calm eyes. "I'm not claiming. I am." The guard snorted and walked away. Time dragged. The buzz of the flickering light was the only clock ticking forward. Outside the cell, life continued. But inside, Michael sat in the center of a broken system that didn't even recognize one of its own. The morning shift as the sun rose. The mood in the jail changed. Officers moved faster. Phones rang. Files shuffled. Detainees stirred in their cells. The air, still stale, now buzzed with the dull rhythm of bureaucracy. Around 9 a.m., a sergeant walked by and glanced at Michael's chart. His eyes widened, slightly, scanning the name again. "Huh," he muttered, eyebrows raised. By 10 a.m., the door opened. Michael was told he'd be moved to a temporary holding area to await court. Still, no one apologized. Still, no one treated him as anything more than a suspect. While he changed into a clean shirt they brought him, one of the younger officers finally asked, "So what's your deal? You really a judge?" Michael nodded. "What court?" "County. District Court. Third Circuit." The young officer's eyes widened slightly. "That's where we're headed." The twist they didn't see coming. At 12:45 p.m., a clerk entered the holding room with a stack of case folders. He glanced at Michael, then did a double take. He leaned into the ear of the sergeant and whispered something urgently. The sergeant turned white. "Wait, that's him?" he asked. The clerk nodded. Suddenly, the room grew still. A supervisor entered moments later and double-checked the booking documents. Then, he looked at Michael and muttered, "Sir, Your Honor." Michael didn't say a word. They hadn't believed him last night when he calmly presented the truth. But now that the wheels of the system, ironically slower than the lies they believed, had caught up, reality was undeniable. Finally, the sergeant spoke. "Well, sir, you'll be in front of the judge after lunch. Maybe they'll cut you some slack." Michael looked him dead in the eye, not with anger, but with firm resolve. He didn't smirk. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said, "I am the judge." The room went quiet. The sergeant gave an awkward chuckle, still trying to convince himself this was all a joke. "Yeah, okay," he said, looking away. But Michael wasn't joking. His case, the one these very officers had manufactured, was first on the docket after the lunch recess. Only this time, The man they arrested wasn't standing before the bench, he was sitting behind it. Courtroom 3B was buzzing long before the session even began. Word had spread like wildfire through the courthouse halls that morning. "Did you hear what happened to Judge Davis?" whispered clerks, reporters, and junior attorneys. Some had read the preliminary police report. Others had seen the grainy cell phone footage of a black man being arrested in a rest stop parking lot. No one could have imagined that the man in cuffs was one of the most respected judges in the district. Now, the room was full to the brim. Lawyers in tailored suits lined the benches. Journalists sat ready with notepads and cameras, unsure of what story they were even covering yet, but sensing it would be big. Behind them, everyday citizens, law students, and courthouse staff packed the gallery, shoulder to shoulder. Everyone waited at the prosecution table. The three white officers from the night before stood, still unaware of the full weight about to crash down upon them. One officer, the tall one with the square jaw and short buzz cut, whispered confidently to another, "This'll be quick. We did everything by the book." The second nodded. "Just another angry guy making a scene." They straightened their ties and stood tall, arms behind their backs, smug, comfortable, and oblivious. Then, the double courtroom doors swung open. Silence fell like a curtain. In walked Judge Michael Davis. He wore the same calm, confident expression he always did on the bench. His judicial robe flowed around him like a cape. His steps were steady, his head was held high, and his eyes, locked immediately with the officers, they froze. The smugness evaporated. One officer blinked, his mouth falling slightly open. The youngest one whispered, just loud enough to hear, "Oh, no." Judge Davis approached the bench, taking his seat. Like a king ascending his throne, not in arrogance, but in rightful authority. He adjusted his glasses, then looked over the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice smooth but sharp like a razor's edge. "Today we will be reviewing the arrest of a citizen who was wrongfully detained at a highway rest stop on the evening of July 15th. He paused as a hushed breath swept across the gallery. "I believe that citizen was me," gasped a woman in the back, covered her mouth. The stenographer's fingers hesitated for half a second. The courtroom exploded in murmurs, which the bailiff quickly silenced with a firm order in the court. The officers looked like their world had just collapsed. Turning the tables, Judge Davis continued, "Before we proceed, let me remind everyone that this courtroom is not a place for spectacle. It is a place of law, a place of truth, and above all, a place where justice must be done, without fear, favor, or bias." He gestured to the prosecution table. "Officers, you may now explain your justification for the arrest of Michael J. Davis, resident, father, legal scholar, and judge of this very court." The lead officer cleared his throat, fumbling through his notes. "Your Honor, we received a call about a suspicious individual matching the general description of the defendant, yourself, and we acted accordingly." "General description?" Judge Davis leaned forward. "What was the description, officer?" The man stuttered, Black male, loitering near cars. Late 30s to 50s, possibly armed." "Interesting," Davis said, his voice unwavering. "Did you find any weapons?" "No, sir." "Did I resist arrest?" "Well, you questioned our authority. That's not resisting. That's called speaking." The courtroom chuckled. Quietly, the second officer jumped in, trying to salvage the moment. "We didn't realize who you were. Had we known," Judge Davis cut him off, had you known I was a judge, I would have been treated differently." The room froze again. "No. We just meant," the officer stumbled. Michael didn't press further. He didn't need to. The silence carried the weight of truth. Justice served after allowing the officers to speak and watching them dig themselves deeper. Judge Davis nodded to the bailiff. "Play the video." A large screen displayed the bystanders' recording. The courtroom watched as Michael, calm and collected, stood up at the rest stop. He reached for his wallet. An officer slapped it away. Within seconds, he was cuffed and shoved into the car. There was no raised voice, no threat, only humiliation. When the video ended, the only sound was the hum of the air conditioner. Judge Davis exhaled slowly. "I have sat on this bench for 14 years, he said. "I have seen hardened criminals, frightened immigrants, single mothers, broken veterans. I've ruled over murders, robberies, divorces, and fraud. But I have never sat in this chair after being treated like a criminal myself. He turned toward the officers. You did not see me that night. You saw a threat. You saw a black man, and you chose power over truth. And now, the truth has brought you here. The younger officer had tears in his eyes. The verdict that echoed here is my ruling, Judge Davis said, voice echoing off the paneled walls. The charges filed against me are hereby dismissed with prejudice. They should never have existed. He paused, looking directly at the officers again. This court will also submit a formal complaint to Internal Affairs regarding the conduct of Officers Peterson, Hayes, and McNeil. The Department of Justice will receive this footage, and civil rights charges may be considered. It is not my place to ruin lives, but it is my duty to protect them. He stood. And remember this: justice is not a uniform. It is not a badge. It is not a robe. Justice is how we treat people when no one is watching. The courtroom stood with him. Applause broke the silence. Not loud, not disrespectful, just steady, emotional, and filled with awe. Judge Davis turned and exited through the same door he entered, leaving behind 3 officers, a courtroom forever changed, and a nation watching every second unfold on social media. The courtroom was tense. Every breath, every rustle of paper, every whisper was swallowed by the thick silence hanging in the air as the hearing began. All eyes were locked on the man behind the bench, Judge Michael Davis, who just 24 hours earlier had been unlawfully arrested and humiliated by the very officers now standing before him. The prosecution table was unusually quiet. The 3 white officers who had once seemed so confident now looked like children called to the principal's office. Their uniforms, once symbols of authority, now seemed like costumes, thin layers covering fear, discomfort, and regret. Begin the playback, Judge Davis instructed calmly. The bailiff nodded and tapped a few keys. A large screen flickered to life at the front of the courtroom. The lights dimmed slightly, and then, the moment that had already begun going viral online, played for the entire room. Roll the tape, movie camera. The video, shaky but clear, began with a wide shot of the rest stop. Michael was seen sipping his coffee, scrolling on his tablet, minding his business. The timestamp matched the police report. Nothing seemed unusual. Then came the flashing red and blue lights. The squad cars swerved in fast, aggressive. The officers jumped out and immediately approached Michael with tense body language. One shouted, "Put your hands where we can see them." The camera zoomed in as Michael calmly stood up, his tone low and measured. "I'm a judge. Here's my ID." But instead of checking it, the lead officer smacked it out of his hand. Audible gasps echoed through the courtroom as the next part of the video played. Michael being forcibly cuffed and shoved against the squad car, while confused onlookers whispered and filmed in shock. There was no threat, no resisting, no crime. Only a man being profiled and punished for simply existing in the wrong skin. So, what exactly was the crime? When the footage ended, the lights came back on, but the silence remained. Judge Davis took off his glasses and placed them gently on the desk. He folded his hands, looked directly at the officers, and asked, "Would any of you care to explain, under oath, what you just saw?" Officer Peterson, the one who had led the arrest, cleared his throat. His voice, once loud and assertive, now trembled. "We, believed he matched a report we'd received earlier in the evening. A call came in about a black male loitering near cars at the rest stop. We thought he might fit the description." Judge Davis nodded slowly. "And what, exactly, was that description?" Peterson paused. "Just a black male. In his 30s to 50s, loitering. Possibly suspicious." Davis tilted his head. "So, no physical threat, no mention of a crime, no vehicle details, no prior warrants, no weapons involved?" "No, sir." "Was I doing anything illegal?" "No, sir." "Did I resist arrest?" Another pause. "No, sir." You cooperated." Judge Davis raised an eyebrow. "And yet you charged me with loitering and resisting arrest." Peterson stammered. "We were trying to maintain control of the situation." "You mean a situation you created?" Davis asked, his voice sharp but controlled. "A situation where a law-abiding citizen, who identified himself as a judge, was handcuffed, humiliated, and denied a phone call or basic dignity." The courtroom was utterly silent. Only the ticking of the courtroom clock could be heard now. The badge isn't a shield. Officer Hayes, the youngest, stepped forward. Sir, we didn't know who you were. Michael's tone shifted, firmer, colder. So, had I been a janitor or a fast food worker, your actions would have been acceptable? No, Your Honor, that's not what I meant. But that's what you said. Hayes looked down, ashamed. Judge Davis leaned back. You see, gentlemen, that's the heart of the problem. You didn't see a man. You didn't see a citizen. You saw a stereotype. You saw a threat. And instead of investigating or using your training, you used force. Your instincts weren't shaped by facts. They were shaped by fear. And your fear came from bias. This bench isn't just for me. He looked around the courtroom, locking eyes with the reporters, the citizens, the clerks, and then back to the officers. For over a decade, I have presided over this court. I have ruled in favor of police officers. I have defended your profession. I've stood up for law enforcement in tough situations when others were quick to judge. He paused. But what happened to me proves what too many Americans, especially Black Americans, already know, that the uniform is sometimes used as armor to hide behind, instead of a duty to serve with humility. One officer wiped his eyes. You mocked me. You denied me a phone call. You didn't even bother to verify my identity. You simply chose to believe I was guilty without evidence. You chose your assumptions over the truth. That's not policing. That's profiling. Justice. Delivered. Judge Davis took a deep breath. Let the record show I was wrongfully arrested. No probable cause. No justification. Charges dismissed. The courtroom, though quiet, pulsed with energy. He then added, this matter will be referred to internal affairs for investigation into misconduct, racial profiling, and possible civil rights violations. You are innocent until proven guilty, but you will be held accountable. His voice dropped into a lower, calmer register. I hold this gavel not just for myself, but for every man who never got to walk into this courtroom because his story ended on the street. I survived this experience. Others do not. That's why this moment matters. The gavel fell, but so did the mask, and with one final strike of the gavel, the hearing concluded. But what had just happened would ripple far beyond the walls of courtroom. 3 beat at the officers walked out with their heads down. The cameras rolled. The headlines would write themselves. And Judge Michael Davis? He stood taller than ever, not just as a judge, but as a symbol of what justice looks like when the truth finally gets its day in court. Judge Michael Davis didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the gavel in anger. He didn't use his bench as a platform for revenge. He didn't need to. The truth already stood tall in the courtroom, visible for all to see. Instead, he leaned forward slowly, resting his hands on the polished oak desk, and said in a voice calm but unshakable, you judged me based on the color of my skin, not the content of my character or the truth of my credentials. And that is why you're here today. The words didn't just echo in the room. They sank deep into every heart present. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with reflection, with discomfort, with realization. Then, in one precise, powerful moment, he reached for the case file marked with his own name, drew a red pen, and marked it clearly, unlawful arrest. All charges dropped. Justice begins with truth, but Judge Davis didn't stop at clearing his own name. He turned to the responsibility that came with the robe, the duty to protect others, even those who don't have cameras, credentials, or a courtroom full of witnesses. This is bigger than me, he said, standing. Today, I walked into this courtroom with power, but yesterday, I was stripped of it. I was dismissed, ignored, and treated like a threat because of my skin color. If this can happen to me, a judge, imagine what happens to the people with no titles, no platforms, no evidence, and no voice. He looked straight at the 3 officers. This isn't personal. It's systemic. He then issued a formal referral to Internal Affairs in the Department of Justice to investigate not just the officers involved in his arrest, but the patterns behind their behavior, the assumptions, the abuse of power. This court is not here for retribution. It is here for accountability, he said. Poetic justice goes viral within hours. A clip of Judge Davis's closing remarks was shared by a local reporter on social media. By nightfall, it had over 5 million views. The comment section lit up like wildfire. "This is the most poetic justice I've ever seen. Fire, fire," he could have screamed. Instead, he taught a masterclass in power and grace. Imagine arresting a judge, then standing in front of him the next day. I'm speechless. By the next morning, the headline was everywhere. Judge arrested at rest stop presides over. Hearing delivers powerful lesson on racial justice. News outlets from CNN to BBC covered the story. Talk shows discussed it. Legal podcasts dissected every second of the courtroom video. And perhaps most powerfully, law schools across the country began including the case in their ethics and criminal justice curriculums. Not as a mere incident, but as a modern fable. A real-life parable of how integrity, patience, and truth can dismantle prejudice without ever lifting a fist. The dignity of not striking back. What shocked people most wasn't just the irony of the case. It was how Judge Davis handled it. But he didn't rant. He didn't rage. He didn't insult or degrade the officers, even though they had done so to him. Instead, he let the facts speak, let the truth breathe, and let justice walk in on its own 2 feet. Psychologists and civil rights leaders praised his restraint as a model of emotional strength. Teachers played the footage in classrooms. Parents showed it to their children. He didn't just win, one commentator said. He elevated the meaning of winning. The officers faced their reckoning in the weeks that followed. The 3 officers were suspended pending internal investigation. Several more citizens came forward with similar complaints, previously brushed off or ignored. Now, with the public spotlight glaring down, their voices were finally heard. The police department issued a formal apology. The mayor called Judge Davis personally, but Michael didn't revel in it. "This isn't about me," he said in an interview. "This is about the system that lets things like this happen in the first place, and how easily the wrong people pay the price for someone else's fear." Judge Davis's final message. Studio microphone. 3 weeks after the hearing, Judge Davis was invited to speak at a national law and justice symposium. He walked on stage to a standing ovation, but his words were humble. "I don't want to be famous for getting arrested. I want to be remembered for how we responded when the mask came off. When bias was exposed, not in theory, but in action." He paused. "I'm not asking for revenge. I'm asking for reform." The audience leaned in. Every officer needs better training, not just in procedures, but in perception. Every citizen deserves to walk freely without being judged by their skin. And every judge, lawyer, teacher, and parent has a role to play in unlearning the instinct to fear difference. He ended with the same line he had said in court. "Justice isn't a uniform. It's not a title. It's how we treat people when no one's watching." Legacy beyond the gavel. Since the incident, Judge Davis has become a quiet force for change. Not a celebrity, not an activist, but a symbol. He continues to rule from the bench with wisdom. But now, when he walks into a courtroom, every officer looks at him differently. Not because he's powerful, but because he proved that real power comes not from punishment, but from principle. And to the millions who watched, listened, and learned, his story became more than just a viral headline. It became a reminder that sometimes the most powerful sound in a courtroom is silence, followed by truth. They arrested a man thinking he was powerless, only to find out he was the one who holds the gavel. Remember, never judge a book by its cover, especially when that book is the judge of your fate. #racial justice, #real story, #Judge Michael Davis, #poetic justice.